Hello friends, and welcome once again to a Walk in the Garden Bible study. This is part 2 in our study of Genesis chapter 13. And if you were with us for our last lesson, you remember we left off studying on the first 4 verses of chapter 13. And we've been studying and looking at the life of Abram and Lot and their families, and we noticed how they had journeyed out of Egypt. They'd gone back into Canaan. They'd pitched their tent between Hai and Bethel. And so that's where we're going to pick it up today, is in verses 5 through 9. And we saw last time how they had kind of rekindled and renewed their vows before the Lord. They'd gone back to that special place of Bethel where they had once had sweet fellowship with God, and where God had once again reminded them of their commission, of Abram's commission, that he was going to show him all of this land, and all of this land that he was going to have for a possession, and that his seed was going to be blessed and inherit the land wherein they dwelt. So we're going to pick it up here in verses 5 through 9, and we see the Bible says, "And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks, and herds, and tents. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. And Abram said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren. It is not the whole land before thee. Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left." And so we were talking last time about how before Abram and Lot had entered into the land of Egypt, they'd taken all their possessions and all of their family members and all of their servants with them. But we had seen how Pharaoh had kind of just showered possessions and showered treasures and riches upon Abram for Sarai's sake, because he had all intention on making her his wife. And then because of the plagues that God had laid down upon Pharaoh, he ordered them to leave the country. He had them escorted out of the country, but he also allowed them to keep all of these additional possessions. So they were burdened down now. They were burdened down with riches. They were burdened down with wealth. It said they had silver and gold and cattle and asses and just all kinds of things that brought wealth and brought prosperity to their families. And so they had left out of Egypt with much more than they had entered with, and now we see them back in the land. They've been still trying to dwell together, but it's becoming a problem. It's becoming a problem because they're overlapping with each other. And we're reminded that back in verse 1 that the Bible tells us, as they went into the south, and their family left Egypt. But Lot and his family left as well. They all still clung together. They've been journeying together. They were family. So they were sticking together. And they were still banded together at this time. And it had been months, if not years, since leaving the Ur of the Chaldees. Because, one thing that we have to remember is that when they traveled, many times they were traveling on foot. Or they were traveling by camel. But it was a slow process. It was a slow and arduous process. They had to, and plus when you're having to manage all of this livestock at the same time, you have to keep them in position. You have to keep them herded together, make sure you don't lose any. You have to protect them against any kind of outside influences or wild animals. You have to make sure they got enough to eat and enough to rest, and it's just a major operation. And we can even think back in the early days of America when they used to drive the big cattle herds from Texas all the way up to places like Kansas City or Omaha. And it was a major operation, and sometimes it would take literally months to cross the distance with that amount of animals just to get them to where they were going. But they were patient, and they just knew that it was a fact of life. But we think about our modern transportation, how we can travel 5 or even 600 miles or more in one day's time, just in that, in an 8-hour to 10-hour period. And back then, that type of journey would have took weeks, if not months, depending on the weather conditions and the health of everybody and all of those things that were needed to be handled. And so it was a major journey for Abram and his family. And now apparently, with all of the extra possessions that they had picked up in Egypt, and all the extra goods and the extra livestock that Pharaoh had bequeathed upon them, well, now they were beginning to see some difficulty in managing the two groups together. And that's the way it is anywhere. I mean, we think back to the range wars, where they had wars between different different owners of lands, and they would brand their cattle so they would know who's belonged to who. But for the longest time, they had open ranges out west, and that was where they didn't have any fences, they didn't have any barriers, and they were just allowed to freely graze. And many times there were scuffles, if not more serious incidents, as a result of somebody's livestock getting over on their land. And maybe they were drinking their water, maybe they were eating their grasslands, or maybe they were just infiltrating their herds. But there would be a lot of dissension and a lot of ill feelings one towards another, because they were just being not only jealous or maybe envious, but also in some cases they were just getting tired of having to manage other people's livestock that was getting over on their land. And so basically that's what we see here between Abram and Lot. What does it tell us? It tells us, well, there were disputations, there were arguments, and maybe even scuffles between the herdsmen of the two families. And it could have been over the same things that we just talked about, things like water supplies, things like the food supplies. Perhaps they were having the very same trouble of keeping the animals separated and trying to discern who's belonged to who, and did you have more than, I'm missing a couple, and did you take them on purpose, or was it an accident that they just happened to get over in your herd? I mean, all these things, they were just real situations between real people, and these people were just concerned, just as we would be today. And they were also responsible for the herds, and so they took the responsibility seriously. And it was in their area of responsibility to manage the livestock, and to manage the herds, and to manage the doings of them. And so the conflicts were apparent, and it got brought before Abram. He knew what was going on. He'd been told, they came up and they told him every day what was going on, and some of the difficulties they were having, and some of the troubles they were having. And they were getting angry towards Lot's family and towards his servants. And so Abram, you had to use some wisdom. And he had to say, hey, we've got to resolve this issue. And he came to the conclusion that it was just not wise for them to remain in close proximity. Because if they did, then they would risk a major falling out between the groups. And the fact is, they were family. So he didn't want that to happen. He didn't want to have any ill feeling towards Lot. He didn't want Lot to have any ill feelings towards him. So he felt like the best and smartest thing to do was we just need some distance in between us. We need to get some distance in between us. We need to manage our own properties, our own animals. And he told Lot, he said, just look at the expanse of the land. There's plenty to choose from. We don't need to be living this close together. And he was even going to give Lot the pick of the land. He said, look, you look out there and you choose, and whatever you choose, I'll go along with it. But in addition, there were other flocks and herds in the area. I mean, there were other, they weren't the only two ranchers around. I mean, what did it tell us? It said the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled in the land. So they were already there. There were already ranchers there. They already had their stakes put out there, their land that was staked out. They already had their borders. And so in between that, they had to watch out for them as well. So Abram's suggestion was that it was time to go their separate ways and put some distance in between them. And since this was to be the land of their possession, the land of their habitation, that he felt that they could now safely separate and basically, to paraphrase it, choose their own neck of the woods. And so what do we see? Well, we see that Abram was more than fair about the arrangement that they were going to make. Because even though he's the elder, even though he, what he said would go, and even though he's the decider, and even though he is the inheritor of the land, I mean, God has told him personally that this land belongs to him and his seed. So he's the inheritor of the land. He's the possessor of the land, and it was given to him by God. But even though all of these things fell in line, and he would be justified, and he would have every right to make the decision and to pick the land that he wanted and make his own decisions on what they were going to do, he chose to let Lot have first choice, to let Lot have dibs on the land. In other words, he says, I really don't care, Lot. I just want to maintain peace in the family. I want to maintain our relationship, our close relationship that we've had. We've shared a lot of times together. We've shared a lot of, hardships and we just, shared that scuffle with Pharaoh together. And I just want us to continue to get along because we are blood relatives. And he says, I'm content to stay or I'm content to move. Whatever the case is, the choice is yours. And whatever you choose, I will go the opposite direction of whatever you decide. And I'll be perfectly content to do so. So a couple things we can notice here about Abram's decision and about these arrangements. First of all, what was at the heart of the conflict in the first place? Well, it was their riches. We talked to some length in our last lesson about the burden of being a wealthy person, and the fact that it could become a headache and it could become a real burden, and it's just because of the magnitude of the responsibilities of being wealthy and all of the duties and responsibilities and the management and everything that comes with it. There's a lot to be contained and a lot to be responsible for and to be managing. And so it was the riches. They both had riches. They both had increase. They both had major flocks and herds. And they both had many servants. And they both maintained an entourage and their own individual families. So there was a lot of responsibility involved. And now it had gotten to the point that the land, what does the Bible tell us? It says the land was not able to bear them. And you can have large herds, but if you don't have enough food supplies or water supplies to sustain them, then you're not going to be doing very well. You're not going to be having very good success with raising the animals and keeping them healthy. And so either you have to expand your land or you have to find a new land, and so that's what they had to do. It wasn't necessarily the living quarters, but it was the lack of adequate grazing land for the herds. And then secondly, the problem of setting them at variance one with another. Their relationship was beginning to falter a little bit. It was no longer as it once was. And they were seeing some dissension, not only between the troops there, but also they were getting ill feelings one towards another. There was border battles. There was quarrels going on. There was ill feelings between their camps. There was a lot of murmuring and talking behind the scenes. Pride, envy, and covetousness were now starting to rear their ugly heads. And they had now come on the scene. And at the risk were relationships and friendships, the things that were most dearest to them. And then thirdly, they had to be on guard and vigil. They could not afford to be enemies together because there were already other peoples groups in the land that may not be so friendly towards them, especially if they would pick up on any kind of weakness within their own family units. Then these other groups might perceive that as a weakness as a whole, that they wouldn't rise up together if anything happened to fight against them. And they might take advantage of that. They might come in and steal their herds or be able to take their lands or be able to just, think that they could overcome them if they weren't going to band together because they had these differences. And we can see that in any grouping. That people that are for the same cause, and they have the same loyalties, and they have the same focus and the same goals in life, and they get along, then obviously they're a stronger unit, whether it be a family, whether it be an army, whether it be a nation, or whether even be the body of Christ. A church body, if they have disunity within the body, then they become weak and they become vulnerable to the attacks of the devil and the attacks of the world. They become vulnerable because they're no longer in unity. They can no longer move ahead in one accord. And so it's a very dangerous place to be. And so that's another reason why they needed to resolve this situation quickly before it got out of hand, because there could be, at any moment, they don't know, there could be conflict come about with either the Canaanite or the Perizzite. But together, they could withstand a situation like that, but separated, they would be well more susceptible to, being plundered or worse. And, Ben Franklin once had a quote that kind of makes a lot of sense. He said, "We shall all hang together, or we shall all hang separately." So that can be used in a lot of different situations. But what do we notice about Abram's resolve here, how he's going to come up with a solution? Well, we see that he says, "Let there not be strife, I pray thee." Abram wasn't haughty. He wasn't prideful. He didn't have to have everybody take notoriety of him, or he didn't have to put himself on a pedestal and make sure everybody knew his position. Because, somebody that really knows their position, and they know it's rightfully theirs, and they know that people recognize that, they don't have to flaunt it because they have it. And the only thing that happens when you flaunt that is it makes people feel like you're condescending or you're putting them down and trying to make sure they know their place. And so they become spiteful because of that, and it can cause a real issue. But Abram didn't choose to do that. He says, like we said, it was his right to choose. His right, for him to choose his own lands. He could have chosen, and ultimately his decision of what Lot would be required to adhere to. He could have told Lot what it was that he was to do, and how he was going to obey, and how he was going to, where he was going to live, and what, he could have done that. He had every right to. But in his willingness to be completely fair, and in an effort to, rebuild that unity, he would relinquish his decision to Lot himself. The choice would be Lot's. He says, "Let there be no strife between me and thee." He would seek to avoid a falling out. He would seek to avoid a separation in their ranks and in their unity. And he would resolve to avoid further contention, which would be in the best interest of all. For we must remember, first and foremost, what does he say? He says, "We are brethren." Let's get back to the basics, Lot. Let's get back to what's really the important issue. And he said that we shouldn't have any dissension between. We're brethren. We're brethren. And as such, we can resolve this thing. We can get this thing worked out. There may be a time when we will have contentions with the heathen around us, but as far as within our household, let this not be the case. And so that's a good lesson to be learned here, that we who are brethren, we should always be well considering our relationship one with another. That should be one of the most vital, most important, most dearest things to us that there is maintaining a positive relationship with our brethren. And, we should always seek to prevail, to moderate our passions, and either to prevent or put an end to our contentions. We're to love the brethren, and we can't do that if there's some kind of strife between us. And then the other lesson we see here is that we should put action behind our words. Abram wasn't just all words. He didn't just say, "Yeah, we need to do this, and here's what we need to do." Well, he put action behind it. He said, "Well, because we need to do that, then here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let you make the decision." Men who profess to be for peace and unity and in brotherly love, but do nothing towards it, then are they really sincere? So, what did Abraham ask Lot? He said, "Is not the whole land before thee?" We have no need to quarrel. I mean, look at the expanse before them. I mean, there's plenty of room for us to spread out. There's plenty to meet all of our needs. There's plenty to, satisfy all of our wants and all of our, desires. So he says, "Seek out that which you desire, and I will go the opposite direction. Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me." So Abram's not going to expel Lot. He's not going to force Lot away. But rather, what does he do? He just simply advises him that it is simply time for them to separate. And though it be Abram's promised land, he was willing to share it with Lot in order to preserve the peace. Well, we're going to leave off there, and we're going to pick it up next time in verses 10 through 13. And we're going to see what Lot's decision is going to be. We're going to see what particular land area he chooses. And it's going to have a significant, it's going to make a significant event in the future, things that are going to happen because of the choice that he makes. And we can't stress that enough, that every choice has consequences. Every choice has results. And whenever we are making a choice, and I said this before, whether we're buying a house, whether we could be buying a piece of property, whether we're going to move our family into a different location, then there's a lot of things to be considered. And most of all, we need to have the peace of God about that decision. We need to have God's peace. We need to make sure it's the Holy Spirit's leadership and directing us there. And if it is, then we have no fears. We have no reservations, but we just go ahead and move forward. But if we don't have that, and if we don't do the proper observances and the proper research and the proper maybe just looking ahead and investigating some things, and then making a wise choice, then sometimes we can end up in some really bad situations. And so we're going to see that in our next lesson, so I hope you'll stick around for that, and we'll see you then. Thanks.